have been talking a lot about the workers, I would say the past couple of months with all of the strikes that have been happening in the United States and actually globally. We've been talking about the strikes happening in the UK as well, which shout out to the people in the UK. They're doing the damn thing. I kind of feel like they're having like a soft general strike, so to speak, because they have multiple companies working together, different industries like striking together in solidarity. That being said, if you have not noticed, there has been more networks, I would say mainstream media networks, that have been demonizing workers as of late. Last year, they were cheering on some of these strikes. They were applauding some of these strikes, including the Amazon unionization, all of that. And now we're starting to see that the tides are changing because we are now in 2023. And I don't think they expected this to continue. Now, this goes into the NYC nurses strike. But before I get to that, I think we all need to be prepared for what they are going to try to do next. And I talked about this briefly on the Jimmy Dore show about how now there are suggestions being made, and Larry Summers was one of the people that made the suggestion, that the Fed should have to intervene. The Fed should have to intervene in reference to the labor market. I think that would be a disaster. I'm not for this. I hope you guys are not for it. But this is what they're talking about. See, they're already preparing to prevent future strikes and unionization. So let's go ahead and get into this piece here. I thought this was pretty interesting.
You know, actually, so far in 2023, what's worked this year is what worked last year. International markets have actually held up better, which they did last year. Values held up better. The financials did fine today, relatively. It just continues to be valuation compression. I mean, the challenge for this year is that nobody really knows, right? So I think the high end of the S&P targets is like 5,000. The low end is 3,000. So on any given day, the market's just waiting for a report from the Fed on earnings, and we're only going to, average hourly earnings on wages, and we're only going to get 12 of those this year. So there are going to be 12 data points this year that matter, and in between those, we'll just fluctuate back and forth.
Anthony David says nobody knows. We trust in you to know. Are we going to continue this type of action? What do you see as a potential low for the S&P?
Well, for sure, David is right. No one knows for sure. I think the S&P could go down another 20 or 30% from here, which then puts us in that 3,000 range that we're talking about as well, that David has suggested. So I don't think there's anything unrealistic about that at all. It's all going to boil down to what the Federal Reserve does, and the Federal Reserve is all going to boil down to what interest rates, what inflation does, and inflation is going to boil down what happens to the unemployment number. It's the unemployment number right now that is keeping everything at bay. It's keeping inflation high. It's keeping the Federal Reserve on a very aggressive path. They've told us that they're going to keep raising rates. The challenge, though, is that when you have your foot on the gas and you're coming up to traffic and you see some brake lights start to get on, you want to take your foot off the gas. You want to act with a little bit of caution. You want to approach a traffic cautiously, slowly, looking around, and you don't want to keep your foot on the gas because you're going to crash into the cars in front of you if you're not cautious. And they kept their foot off the gas too long at the beginning of the inflation cycle, and they didn't catch up to speed. All the cars were passing them, and now the cars are slowing down. And as they're approaching, they're keeping their foot on the gas. I'm just afraid that they're going to drive this economy into a recession that's going to be much deeper, much longer than it needs to be. They need to ease off the gas and just look at what's happening with inflation. Inflation has already started to slow down, but they need to take a look at that, take a pause, to coast a little bit before continuing to press down on that gas pedal.
David, how aggressive do you expect the Fed to be this year? And talking about Anthony's point, easing up a bit, when exactly do you expect that to actually happen?
Here we go.
I mean, we got a big data point today that people glossed over, which was Bullard sort of softening a little bit, and he's been an ultra hawk. What freaks out the Fed is inflation, right? We topped out at the CPI at 9%. Now we're at 7%. But during that period of time, over the last 6 months, wage inflation's gone nowhere. So to get the average hourly earnings percentage down from 5% where it is today to 3% or less where they're comfortable is going to require 2 million people to lose their jobs, right? So the sooner, let me say it this way. Last year, it was the Fed versus the markets, right? They needed valuations to come down. They wanted equities to go down. They wanted bonds to go down. They wanted housing prices to go down. They got that. This year, it's going to be the Fed versus employers. And what the Fed has told employers is we're not going to stop until you fire 2 million people. So
that piece right there. So the Fed apparently has told employers, we're not going to stop until you fire 2 million people. But according to Joe Biden, the economy is doing great. The unemployment rate is great. Record low numbers. 2 million people. A friend of mine just got laid off today, by the way. She works in healthcare. Let's go on.
It's great that Amazon laid off 18,000 for their purposes, but we got a long way to go. So there's going to be a whole lot more reductions in payrolls to try and force that wage number down. And based upon the jolts yesterday, we still have 10.5 million jobs available for 6 million people unemployed. So that's why the Fed feels like they've got to be tighter for longer. But I think one more quarter in rate hikes, and we should be done because M2 is actually shrinking year over year. I mean, when you add the rate hikes at this pace and you add quantitative tightening into the mix, there's an enormous amount of liquidity being sucked out of the system. And I agree, they need to pause. And Bullard sort of suggested that maybe today.
Sounds as though, Anthony.
Did you guys notice that he just applauded the Fed telling employers to fire more people? Now, he mentioned Amazon. Amazon laid off. He's like, they had laid off like 18,000 people. And the way he said it, as though it was no big deal. They laid off 18,000 people. Yeah, but we need to do more. More people need to be fired. No empathy at all. Where are all those people supposed to go? It's just, this is how little they care about the workers. How little they care about the workers.
We're still going to have no cuts until 2024 and somewhere a terminal rate between 5 and 5.5. Is that what you think they'll do?
Yeah, I do. I think that I'd love for David to be right. I would love for them to just have one more and then pause. The forecasts that I've read have said that it's going to take us to 5.5%, which then means they're going to have to go another 1 or 1.5% from here, where we are. So the reality is that as much as I'd love for them to pause, I don't think that they're going to. And that unemployment number, until we can get back down to where there's only 1.2 jobs available to every worker, like we were pre-COVID, they're going to keep their foot on the gas. Right now, there's one.
Let's look at this really quick. That's right, Colin, the sin of capitalism, y'all. Let's look at this really quick. The unemployment rate. So here we are in 2020. Obviously, that spike there was due to the pandemic. That's part of the reason why it spiked that high. And it started to go down. And what you do have to remember is that in 2022, last year in September, was that last September or the year before? Shoot, I forget. It was either last year or the year before. It might have been the year before when they actually kicked people off of unemployment. That was when Joe Biden did that on Labor Day. I remember that happening. And that was part of the reason why the unemployment rate went down so low. But you would never hear them admit that. Pramila Jayapal won't admit that. Ro Khanna won't admit that. Joe Biden won't admit that. They'll just say Biden has been doing great because he has record low unemployment numbers, and totally leave out the fact that he kicked all those people off during unemployment, or kicked all those people off on Labor Day. They would totally leave that out. But if you were to look back, you would even see going back to 2011, the unemployment numbers were higher. You see what I mean? So yeah, they are going down, but you have to understand how they actually calculate unemployment. Unemployment does not refer to people who are adults that live with their parents. So if you're one of those people that graduated college, let's say last year or the year before during the pandemic, and you couldn't find a job right away. I had several students that were in that situation, by the way, and you moved back home to live with your parents. You were unemployed, but you were not included in the unemployment rate. You're not head of household. Those people aren't counted for. If you didn't actually file for unemployment, you're not a part of the unemployment rate. So I always argue the unemployment rate is actually higher than what you see in a lot of these graphs.
1.7 million jobs available per worker. That number needs to come down to 1.2 or so, which means unemployment rate needs to go up, as David noted, about 2 million. That puts us in a 5 or 6%, closer to 6% unemployment rate. That's where we need to be in order for inflation to come down, for the Feds to be comfortable pausing.
The way that they just spoke about the Fed coming in and telling employers to fire more people, it's disgusting. This is why I say we need something different. We need a working class labor movement in this country, because the workers were just kind of seen as like not having any type of rights. And speaking of the workers, there was a huge strike happening in New York City. I think someone just mentioned that they just reached a deal, but I'll have to check that. Huge strike happened in New York City with the nurses. Let's go ahead and get into that. And I want to tell you a little bit about the healthcare industry and why I think they have every right to go on strike. Now, this is a short video here from More Perfect Union. They're awesome, guys. Follow them on Twitter. They cover a lot of these strikes. That's usually how I hear about them, unless it's a local strike. And this says, coming off of the night shift at Mount Sinai, NYC Nurses strike. Here we go. All right, so that was kind of like their announcement there. But what people have been wondering is, like, why are they going on strike, right? Like, why is this happening? Sometimes there's this impression that it's always about wages. That's not necessarily the case. For those who have worked in the healthcare industry, especially if you've been a nurse or if you've been a CNA, certified nursing assistant, you know just how long you're on your feet, how many patients you have to deal with throughout the day or one shift. So when people come to me with this statement and they say that, well, these nurses, they work 3 days and then they get 4 days off. Okay, you should shadow some of those nurses on those 3 days that they work, and you can see what they're dealing with. They put up with a lot, dealing with a lot of patients throughout the day. And I think it's important that people understand that, yes, we do need people in the healthcare industry. And yes, people do get sick all the time. So it is important that you have medical facilities staffed. But if you don't want to deal with that issue, then you need to make sure that nurses, and I say nurses because we don't see the doctors going on strike. You need to make sure that the nurses are compensated and that they actually have enough resources to do their job so that they can deal with these patients. Because if you have one nurse on call and they're in the ER and you have a full ER waiting room, well, how is that one nurse going to get through all of those patients? This is important for people to understand. Now, Case Study QB, he clipped this. Shout out to Case for this as well. It was over 7,000 nurses in New York City that went on strike. More power to them. Power to the labor movement. And I want you to hear this discussion on CNN because they explain exactly why they were going on strike in the first place. And again, it's not because of the wages. Listen to this.
Happening right now, more than 7,000 nurses in New York are on strike after negotiations with two of the city's largest hospitals there failed. Tentative deals have been reached in recent days covering nurses at several other hospitals in the area.
Talks with Mount Sinai Hospital on the Upper East Side of Manhattan and at 3 locations of the Montefiore Medical Center in the Bronx, though, failed overnight. Joining us now is Nancy Hagans, president of the New York State Nurses Association. Nancy, good to see you this morning. So, Mount Sinai is saying here that union leadership walked out of the negotiations overnight. They said they proposed a 19.1% wage increase, which a number of other hospitals agreed to. What more do you need this morning, Nancy, to end this strike?
Notice how she framed that. Notice how she framed it. This piece right here.
Mount Sinai is saying here that union leadership walked out of the negotiations overnight. They said they proposed a 19.1% wage increase, which a number of other hospitals agreed to. What more do you need this morning, Nancy, to end?
What more do you need this morning, Nancy? Look, they were for the wage increase. Union leaders walked out. What else do you need, Nancy? How dare you ask for more, Nancy? Shouldn't you just be satisfied with the wage increase? How dare you ask for more? Let's go back in.
This strike.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. From the beginning of a negotiation, it was never about wages. It was always about safe patient care. And Mount Sinai know that what we need from them is proper nurse to patient ratios, is proper enforcement for staffing. And it's really something to hear that all they focus on is wages.
Okay, that piece right there, all they focus on is wages. Let's look at what they're asking for. Increase base salary by 19.1% over 3 years. Again, we have to, so some people saying like, oh, that's too much. This is New York City, and you have to remember just how expensive it is to live in New York City. So just keep that in mind. 2, improve staffing levels. Do you have enough nurses hired? And 3, retain healthcare benefits. Now, you notice the commentator didn't mention anything about those other 2 points. She only brought up the wages. Healthcare is one of the things that they're asking to keep. Retain it. This is another reason why we need Medicare for all, or we need a nationalized healthcare system so that your healthcare is not attached to your employer. And it's not just them. There have been other employees that have gone on strike over the past year and a half that had this same issue. One of the Kellogg's workers came to our general strike summit at RBN. Actually, he came back again after that too. Tyler, he was one of the union reps. Tyler came on and he said one of the things that they were asking for was, again, to retain their health care benefits. So you have some of these employers that are trying to decrease the amount of health care benefits that their employees get. This is the problem with having your health insurance attached to your job. They can change the plan. They can change the health insurance company. I had no say so over what my employer does with my health insurance. Not at all. They can increase the premium. What can you do about it? So this piece is very important. Improve staffing levels. Oftentimes, there are shortages. There are not enough nurses, and there are too many patients. So you may have nurses working around the clock because they don't have enough people staffed. That's another issue. It's not just an issue now. It was an issue during the pandemic, especially here in Boston. And we were shut down. So it was an issue during the pandemic, but it's been an issue before the pandemic. You don't have enough people employed. And what's really interesting to me, because I have several friends that are nurses that went into the healthcare field. I worked in healthcare, but I worked on the finance side of things. And what's interesting to me is that they would tell you that such and such hospital doesn't have any openings for nurses. This is particularly true in a state like North Carolina. They say that North Carolina is oversaturated with nurses. We don't have any open positions. But then you go to these medical facilities and you see they actually do need more nurses. They just don't want to hire them. Let's go back in.
As nurses, when we go to work, we want to provide safe, quality care to our patients. At this stage, we do not have that commitment from Mount Sinai Medical Center as well as Montefiore Medical Center. That is one of the reasons that we are where we are right now.
You mentioned the nurse to patient ratio, which we know is crucial to these negotiations. The number of vacancies, as we understand it, have been high throughout the pandemic, going back 2-3 years now. And I wonder, is it difficult to fill these positions? Is that one of the issues?
Well, that is our concern. Our concern, we would like to have a fair contract where we could really attract and retain great nurses. If you have to go to work in a condition where on a daily that you have to work short, you are asked to care for 20 patients in the emergency room where the ratio should be 3. So a lot of our nurses have walked away from the.
Did you hear what she just said? You may have 20 patients in the emergency room and the ratio is supposed to be 3. So 3 patients to 1 nurse. So just imagine that. That's crazy, right? Notice that she mentioned we want to provide safe care for our patients. So I don't know if any of you have been at the Mount Sinai Hospital in New York City, but they're just letting you know they're not providing safe care for the patients. They're not able to because they're understaffed. So that is a problem. Big one. Let's go on. Oh, I don't know what happened here.
Away from the.
Okay. I think the sound comes back. I don't know what happened with that clip, but.
Last month, I know you also accused hospital management of purposely leaving some of these positions unfilled. Why would they leave those unfilled?
That was a dumb question. I'll answer the question for them. Why would they leave positions unfilled? Because it's less money for the employer. We talked about this the other day on Sunday. I believe it was Sunday I talked about quiet hiring, how they'll leave those positions vacant, or they'll fill those positions with contract employees or temp employees, or they'll just dump that work from the person who left on the people who are left there. That's very common. So this just goes to show you just how out of touch the commentators are. They don't understand. They don't get it. There's a reason for that. There's a financial incentive for that, for those employers to not fill those vacant positions. Well, let's see if we can just, dump the work on the people who are still here and save us some money. It's not just the hospitals. I've seen this in every industry. They do it because it's cheaper for them to do so. Even if that means the employees are going to be overworked, they don't care. They're trying to look at how they can make more money for themselves. Now, there's something I want to mention here about this contract. Let me show you the sign where it says fair contracts right there. Fair contracts for patients and nurses. I want to bring up a hospital here that I know has been problematic in reference to the contract issue and the resources. Brigham and Women's in Boston. It's a popular hospital. A lot of people like it, but Brigham and Women's has a problem. And friends of mine who have worked there will tell you about this as well. Brigham and Women's doesn't have a psych ward. So what would happen is that patients would come in that needed to have some type of psych treatment or behavioral treatment. And because they don't have a psych ward, the nurses that are on call there, they have to deal with those patients and they have no training to deal with patients that have mental illness. This is a problem for Brigham and Women's. And this is why they go on strike all the time. Because people ask this like, Brigham and Women's is on strike again? Yes, because they don't have a psych ward. And they also overwork those nurses. Yes, they get paid pretty well, but it doesn't mean much if you're overworked, you're stressed out, and you can't do your job properly. So that's another one about the contracts. Having fair contracts is important. And they said also for the patients, because if the nurses don't have fair contracts, then neither do the patients.
Filled. Why would they leave those unfilled?
We've been working in those conditions way before the pandemic.
There you go. Bingo. We have been working in those conditions way before the pandemic. What did I tell you? This has been a problem. It's just that when the pandemic happened, it opened people's eyes to it more. But this has been an ongoing issue. Again, the commentators, they're out of touch.
And after the pandemic, management decided to freeze a lot of these positions when they never posted the position. You look at a place at Montefiore Medical Center, they have over 710 positions open. Mount Sinai, 500 position open.
710 positions open, and at the other hospital, over 500 positions open. And she talks about how they freeze the positions and they won't even post the positions. I've seen that happen in higher education, not just in healthcare. Every time an employee leaves and you don't fill that spot, let's say these nurses at Mount Sinai are making roughly about $85,000 a year. That's another $85,000 that the employer doesn't have to pay to an employee. Let's say 100 people leave. Do the math. She said 700. Who's my math people in the chat? 710 positions open that were frozen times 85,000. Let me see if I can do it before you guys. Some of you in the chat are math whiz because I know this. You've done this before. $85,000. $85,000. 710 positions. Whew. That's insane. You beat me to it. I told you. I said you guys are math whizzes. Eric said about 60 million. Sun Moon, 60 million. I'm giving everybody their props. 60 million. Rozelle the Great. Soul, 60 million. Yeah. You see how much money that is? They know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. Elizabeth said, if you think hospitals are bad, you'll be forever changed if you see how our most vulnerable, like the elderly, are cared for in a nursing home. I used to work in a skilled nursing facility. I totally hear you. Totally hear you. Let's go on.
Nurses will not want to work every day and have to carry 3 times the amount of the load. After a while, it's not only physically toxic, but it's mentally toxic. And we want to be able to deliver patient care. And meanwhile, this hospital made a lot of profits. The CEO of those 2 hospitals have made the 7-figure over the past couple of years. And
boom, the CEOs have made 7 figures the past couple of years. Of course, it's always the people at the top that are getting paid bank, and the people underneath them are working more hours and they're getting paid less and they're getting more work dumped on them. They're exploited. If you are not at your best and you are experiencing burnout, burnout is real, and I've been there. Are you going to be able to give those patients 100%? No. And if you can't give those patients 100%, who suffers? The patient. Crazy
what
stuff.
we're asking them is to invest in our communities, invest into the nurses, so we could deliver safe patient care to our patients. Our communities deserve better. New Yorkers deserve better.
Here's the impact on the patients. Babies transferred from NICUs, also known as NICU. Cancer patients forced to find alternative or alternate locations for treatment. That is huge. Elective surgeries postponed. Ambulances being diverted. This is what happens when you don't have enough people staffed at these medical facilities. This is a problem. Transferring a baby from NICU? Have any of you, if you have kids in the chat, have you ever had to go through this where your child was in NICU when they were born? That's dangerous. Taking them away from that. Cancer patients forced to find alternate locations for treatment. Where are they supposed to go if people have to get chemo? This is just elective surgeries postponed. What if you need it now? And of course, ambulance being diverted. In reference to the ambulance thing, did you guys know that some people are choosing not to take an ambulance to the emergency room and calling an Uber instead? You know why? Because that ambulance ride is hella expensive. Hella.
Are you worried, for instance, right now we're showing a list of things that have to happen during this strike, including babies transferred from natal intensive care units. Cancer patients have to move to find their treatment elsewhere. Are you worried about the impact on patients while the strike continues?
Are you worried about the impact on patients while the strike continues? He should be asking the CEOs that question. What are they supposed to do? What are the nurses supposed to do? Just continue to experience burnout? Oh boy, look at his face. Look at his face. Got her with that question. That's what he thinks.
Hospital management have created the crisis. We gave them a 10-day notice on December 30th. The reason we gave them the 10 days was we were giving them the opportunity to either fix the problem by coming to the table and negotiate a fair contract or make proper arrangement. The fact that management decided not to come to the table and have a fair contract, they have failed the community. They have failed the patients.
100%. They gave them a 10-day notice. Some people don't do that. So they knew 10 days in advance, if you don't fix our contract, we're out. We're out. They did nothing about it. Now, some hospitals, if they have that much of a far advance notice, that's when they'll call in some of these travel nursing companies, and they'll ask them to bring the travel nurses to come work in those cities at those facilities. My friend has done that before at those facilities to fill the vacancy. I mean, if they had a 10-day notice, they could have prepped for something like that. But I would encourage those of you who are in that position, who are travel nurses, not to take those assignments because that's crossing the picket line. Just saying. We'll finish up here.
Well, Nancy Hagins, anybody who's had family members, as I have, in long-term care in a hospital knows how important nurses are to their care. So we thank you for taking the time this morning.
Thank you for having me.
It's a hot mess. You know, I think they should interview the CEOs. Maybe they did reach out to them and they decided not to comment there. Now, this was interesting to me. I was surprised to see. Now, Danny Haifong, friend of the show, he actually tweeted about this and he said, my wife is on strike. She is one of the 7,000 plus New York nurses demanding better conditions from Mount Sinai, one of the richest hospitals in the country. Here, a top union leader explains the union's top priority: staffing ratios that protect the safety of nurses and patients alike. So that's Danny. You guys should follow him on YouTube. He hosts a show called The Left Lens. He focuses heavily on foreign policy. Like, Danny's awesome. But let's see what they had to say here.
Mount Sinai Hospital has over 5 nursing vacancies.
So what she's saying is respect the nurses, respect the patients, respect the community.
United to win. We are 42,000 nurses joining together to advocate for our patients, for respect and quality care for all her patients, regardless of their zip code, regardless of their immigration status, regardless. Yes! We take our patients. When do we want it? Now! When do we want it? Say something! Say something! Say something!
Awesome. Solidarity there with the nurses. So I didn't know that about Danny. Now, Danny is he's a fellow Bostonian like me. He's from the Boston area. So I didn't realize that his wife was also one of the strikers until I saw his tweet. So yeah, that is like amazing. I hope they get what they want. Let me go to some of the comments here. E.G. Butler says, isn't this proof of the unstable capitalist system? 100%. Dan A., hospitals not being able to afford health care for their employees is priceless. What more proof do we need that the system is broken? Ilhanor, we can strike together or we can die alone, separated by the ruling class. We only have power in our numbers, 100%. And thank you. Wow. Thank you for the super chat, Isabel. I'm a CNA in dementia care. For those who are not aware, CNA is certified nurse assistant. We are horribly understaffed. No one wants a job where you change diapers, wipe butts, and attacked for $14 an hour. We cannot get raises because we are already close to what new nurses make. It's a domino effect. 100%. CNAs, I feel, are very much underappreciated in the healthcare industry. So if you are not aware of what they do, Isabel is explaining to you what they actually do as part of their job. You know, they are very much important as well. And they're not as much respected. I have noticed that. Stephen says hospitals have to be nationalized like in other countries. Unfortunately, the United States are the odd one out that does not have universal health care. 100%. Elizabeth, as a new nurse, I had to care for 98 patients for a shift when the other nurse called in sick. One nurse to 98 patients. That's insane. Are you guys hearing what Elizabeth said? That's insane. 98 people? That would be like me, because I worked in education for those who are new and don't know. That would be like me having a classroom at a public school with 98 kids in that class by myself. And it's not the same. 98 kids in a public school, K through 12, versus 98 kids at a college class. It's not the same. The college students, for the most part, half of them sit in the back and fall asleep. You don't really have to take care of them, so to speak. But that's insane. That's crazy. .com. These are all issues stemming from a for-profit system of healthcare. They cut services to the bone, pun intended, to increase profits, then blame employees for failures. It's always the workers' faults. Thank you for the super chat, Roger. OASS. Oh, I think you meant pass the New York Healthcare Act. And thank you for the super chat, Loca-Cola. I used to be a CNA years ago. It's boot camp for nurses. I lasted 3 years. Myself and others could have up to 12 plus patients per CNA. Isn't that crazy? That's crazy. The CNAs do a lot. Like, they're the ones sometimes feeding the patients, taking the patients to the bathroom. Like, they're the ones like bathing the patients. Like, without them, what would you do? What would you do? And thank you for the super chat, Louise. I worked for a hospital until 2021. Our insurance was so bad. Doctors in our hospital system didn't accept our insurance. The system is broken. There's a movie called Head of State. It's with Chris Rock. I don't know if you guys have seen it. If you haven't, you should watch it. It makes fun of the political system, but it also points out some real truths. Chris Rock's character that was running for president, one of the things that he said when he was speaking to the crowd was, how many of you work at hospitals you can't afford to get sick at? And the movie's a comedy, but there's real truths in it. Real truths.